before the Imperium, before the Emperor, before the Eldar danced in their crystal palaces, and the orcs roared across the stars, and the Necrons slept in their tombs beneath the surface of 1,000 silent worlds. Before all of it, before everything that the 41st millennium contains, everything that fights and bleeds and dies across a galaxy that has been at war for longer than the human species has existed, there was a civilization. They are called the Old Ones. The name is not their name. It is the name that the species who came after them gave to the gap they left behind. The Eldar call them by various titles in their mythology. The first ones, the Shapers, the creators who walked the galaxy when the galaxy was young, and who built the foundations that everything since has rested on. The name the Old Ones gave themselves, if they had one, is lost. 60 million years of silence have erased it. What remains is the echo, the incomprehensibly vast echo of a civilization that shaped the Milky Way as deliberately as a gardener shapes a plot of earth, and whose garden has been growing wild ever since the gardener disappeared. 60 million years. The number resists comprehension. It is not a historical distance, not the kind of gap that separates one human epoch from another, the kind of distance across which the main events are recoverable and the cultural context is inferable. 60 million years is a geological distance, a cosmological one. The dinosaurs of ancient terror were still alive when the Old Ones were fighting their last war. The species that would eventually produce humanity was, at the time of the Old Ones' disappearance, a small nocturnal mammal hiding from predators in the undergrowth of a world that the Old Ones had seeded with life and then left to develop on its own. Everything that has happened since, every war, every empire, every god born and every civilization destroyed, the entire 10,000-year history of the Imperium of Man, and the 60 million year history of the Eldar Empire before it, has happened in the aftermath. In the debris field, in the ruins of what the Old Ones built and what happened when the building was destroyed. The 41st millennium is not the galaxy's story. It is the epilogue of the Old Ones' story. This is the account of the beginning, of the species that was old when the stars were young, that mastered the universe's hidden dimensions when those dimensions were still peaceful, that created life with the deliberation of an artist and destroyed itself with the thoroughness of a catastrophe. It is the story of the decisions that produced the galaxy's current condition, the warp's corruption, the Necrons' grudge, the Orcs' endless war, the Eldar's existence, and the quality of suffering that permeates every corner of a galaxy that has been broken since before the thing that broke it has been remembered by anyone who is still alive to remember. The Old Ones started everything. Everything includes the horrors. The Old Ones were possibly the first intelligent species in the galaxy. Not the first life. Life had been developing on worlds across the Milky Way for billions of years before the Old Ones achieved sentience. And not the oldest entities. The Catan, the star vampires who would later become their enemies, had existed since the universe's infancy, feeding on stellar energies in a state that was more instinct than intelligence. But the Old Ones were the first to think, the first to build, the first to look at the galaxy and understand it as a place that could be shaped rather than simply survived. They were cold-blooded, reptilian, or something close enough to reptilian that the distinction is academic across 60 million years of separation. Their bodies were patient, evolved for endurance rather than speed, for contemplation rather than reaction, for the long processes that a species with an immense natural lifespan could afford to invest in. An Old One's life spanned millennia, not the artificially extended centuries of a space marine or the rejuvenate, sustained decades of an imperial noble. Millennia of natural biological function, sustained by a physiology that had been shaped by evolution on a world whose conditions are no longer known. This longevity was not simply a biological convenience. It was the foundation of everything the Old Ones accomplished. A species that lives for thousands of years thinks differently from a species that lives for decades. The projects it undertakes are longer. The patience it brings to those projects is deeper. The understanding of cause and effect, the awareness that an action taken now will produce consequences across centuries, is more thorough, more complete, more deeply integrated into the culture's decision-making. The Old One's first great achievement was the understanding of the Imperium. The Imperium. The word itself is a human coinage, the name that the Imperium's scholars gave to the dimension that exists alongside the material universe, the parallel realm of psychic energy that the galaxy's sentient species would later call the warp. But in the era of the Old Ones, the Imperium was not the warp. It was not the roiling nightmare of predatory entities and corrupted energy that the 41st millennium knows. It was something else. It was calm. This requires a recalibration of everything the 41st millennium understands about the realm that lies beyond the material. The warp, as the Imperium knows it, is a realm of chaos, a dimension where the emotions and psychic emanations of the galaxy's sentient species have been concentrated and distorted into entities of malevolent power, where travel is a calculated risk of madness and corruption, where the barriers between the material and the immaterial are constantly tested by things that want to cross them. The warp is dangerous. The warp is hostile. The warp is the dimension that produces daemons and corrupts souls and drives psychers mad. The Imperium that the Old Ones discovered was none of these things. It was a realm of formless psychic energy, without malice, without predatory entities, without the quality of hostility that makes the current warp one of the galaxy's most dangerous environments. The Imperium was simply there, a parallel dimension of energy that could be studied, understood, and used by a species with the intelligence and the patience to learn its properties. The Old Ones studied it, for centuries, for millennia, given their lifespan and their patience. They developed an understanding of the Imperium that no subsequent species has matched, an understanding that allowed them to interact with the dimension in ways that the 41st millennium's most gifted psychers cannot approach. They did not merely use the warp, they shaped it. They built in it. They created structures within the Imperium that served their purposes, that persisted across millennia, that functioned with the reliability of physical engineering applied to a dimension that should not have been susceptible to engineering. The greatest of these structures was the webway. The webway is the network of tunnels through the Imperium that allows instantaneous travel between points in the material universe. To step into the webway on one world and step out on another, light years distant, without the risk of warp travel, without the exposure to the dimension's predatory inhabitants, without the temporal distortions that make warp navigation unreliable, without the specific horror of passing through a realm that is trying to consume you, This is what the webway provides. And the Old Ones built it, not the version the Eldar use. Not the diminished, partially collapsed, increasingly dangerous network that the Eldari navigate in the 41st millennium. The original, the complete, functional, galaxy-spanning network that connected the Old One's civilization across the breadth of the Milky Way, that allowed them to move from world to world as easily as a human walks from room to room, that made the concept of interstellar distance essentially irrelevant to a civilization that could bypass it in a single step. This was the Old One's power, not military force, though they possessed that, not psychic capability, though they were among the most potent psychic beings the galaxy has produced. The webway. The ability to be everywhere, to reach anything, to respond to any threat or opportunity with the speed that instantaneous travel provides. A civilization that controls the webway controls the galaxy, because the civilization that can arrive anywhere in an instant cannot be outmaneuvered by a civilization that cannot. The Old Ones used this power benevolently, or at least, they used it in a way that the available evidence describes as benevolent. The nurturance of younger species, the seeding of life across the galaxy, the development of worlds that could support the kinds of civilizations the Old Ones believed the galaxy should contain. They were gardeners, cosmic gardeners, tending a galaxy-sized garden, planting life where conditions permitted and nurturing it where conditions were marginal, building the kind of diverse, interconnected biosphere that a species with their perspective and their patience believed would produce the best possible outcomes across the longest possible timescales. The galaxy, under the Old One's stewardship, was a project. A deliberate, ongoing, millennia-spanning project of life cultivation and species development. The Old Ones did not simply occupy the galaxy, they improved it. And then a species arrived that was not interested in improvement. A species that was dying, and that hated the Old Ones for living, and that would eventually bring everything the Old Ones had built crashing down. The Necrontyr were born dying. Their homeworld orbited a star that was killing them. Not gradually, not through the slow environmental degradation that most civilizations face over geological time. Actively, the radiation that poured from the Necrontyr's sun, a hostile, scourging star located in the far reaches of the galaxy, in the region that would later be called the Halo Stars, bombarded the species with energy that their biology could not withstand. Cancer, cellular degradation, the progressive breakdown of biological systems that, in a kinder environment, might have sustained lives of centuries. The Necrontyr lived for decades, some for less. Their bodies were blighted from birth, their cells carrying the damage that their sun inflicted on every living thing within its reach. They did not grow old the way most species grow old, the gradual decline of systems that were once healthy, the slow surrender of capability to time. They were sick from the beginning. They aged before they matured. They died before they had time to accumulate the wisdom that their intelligence should have produced. This shaped them. How could it not? A species whose biology is a death sentence develops a relationship with mortality that is different from the relationship a healthy species maintains. The Necrontyr were not afraid of death. They were furious at it. Death was not the natural conclusion of a life well lived. It was the theft of the life they should have had, the robbery of centuries they should have enjoyed, the specific and perpetual injustice of being born into a universe that was killing them for no reason their philosophy could justify. When the Necrontyr looked at the Old Ones, they saw everything they did not have. The Old Ones lived for millennia. The Old Ones moved through the galaxy with the ease that the webway provided. The Old Ones built, created, nurtured, with the patience that their immense lifespans permitted, and that the Necrontyr's truncated lives denied them. The Old Ones were everything the Necrontyr wanted to be, and could not become. And the distance between what the Necrontyr were and what the Old Ones were was the distance between a species that was dying and a species that was immortal. The Necrontyr asked for help. This is the fact that sits at the bottom of everything that followed. The war in heaven, the creation of the Necrons, the corruption of the warp, the 60 million years of consequences that the galaxy is still living with. The Necrontyr petitioned the Old Ones for the secret of their longevity. They asked the beings who had mastered the Imperium and who had built the webway, and who had seeded life across the galaxy to share the knowledge that could save the Necrontyr from the death their biology had condemned them to. The Old Ones refused. Why they refused is not clearly recorded, or rather it is recorded from the perspectives of parties who each have reasons to characterize the refusal in ways that serve their own narrative. The Eldar myths that preserve the most detailed account of this era describe the Old Ones as benevolent guardians who refused the Necrontyr's petition because the Necrontyr were too aggressive, too warlike, too dangerous to be trusted with immortality. In this version, the refusal was wisdom. The Old Ones recognized that a species whose culture was shaped by rage and envy would not use immortality well, and the refusal was an act of cosmic responsibility rather than cruelty. The Necrontyr's own perspective, preserved in whatever fragmentary records the Necrons have maintained across 60 million years of machine existence, tells a different story. In this version, the refusal was indifference. The Old Ones could have helped and chose not to, not because the Necrontyr were unworthy, but because the Old Ones did not care. The gardeners who had seeded life across the galaxy and nurtured countless younger species looked at the dying Necrontyr and decided that their dying was not the Old Ones' problem. The petition was heard and dismissed. The species that was begging for survival was told that survival was not available. The truth is probably somewhere between these versions, and the truth probably does not matter. What matters is the consequence. The Necrontyr's petition was refused. Their species was condemned to its biological death sentence. And the fury that this refusal produced, the absolute, species-wide, civilization-defining rage of a people who had been told by the universe's masters that their suffering was not worth addressing, became the engine that would eventually destroy the Old Ones and reshape the galaxy into the nightmare it has been ever since. The Necrontyr went to war, not because they believed they could win. The military disparity between the Necrontyr and the Old Ones was vast, and the Necrontyr understood this as clearly as anyone. But because the alternative to war was acceptance, and the Necrontyr could not accept the dying, could not accept the refusal, could not accept the existence of a species that had what they wanted and would not share it. The war was not a calculated military action. It was an act of rage directed at the universe's injustice. expressed through the only means available to a species whose technology was advanced, but whose biology was a prison. The First War was a catastrophe for the Necrontyr. The Old One's mastery of the webway allowed them to outmaneuver every Necrontyr offensive. The Necrontyr fleet would move to attack a position, and the Old Ones would already be elsewhere, stepped through the webway to a location the Necrontyr could not reach, responding to the Necrontyr's movements with the speed that instantaneous travel provided. The Necrontyr fought with conventional interstellar technology. The Old Ones fought with the ability to be anywhere in the galaxy in an instant. The contest was not close. The Necrontyr were defeated, pushed back to the margins of the galaxy, to the halo stars that had produced them, exiled and forgotten by the civilization they had dared to challenge. The Old Ones returned to their garden. The Necrontyr returned to their dying. But the dying did not make them less angry. It made them more. And in the darkness of their exile, in the radiation-scorched margins of the galaxy where the Old Ones had pushed them, the Necrontyr found something in their sun that would change everything. The C'tan were older than the Old Ones, older than life, older, in some accounts, than the galaxy itself. They had existed since the universe's infancy, beings of pure energy born in the fires of creation, feeding on the radiation of stars. They were not intelligent in the way that biological species are intelligent. They were something else. Vast, diffuse, predatory the way a fire is predatory, consuming what fueled them without the deliberation that consciousness provides. They drifted between stars, feeding on stellar radiation, existing in a state that was less than awareness and more than instinct. The Necrontyr found them, in the hostile star that was killing them, in the same radiation that shortened their lives and blighted their bodies. The Necrontyr's scientists detected something that was not radiation, something that lived in the star's output, that fed on the energy the star produced, that existed within the fire, as a parasite exists within a host. The Necrontyr studied the entity. They learned what it was. And they understood, with the specific clarity of a species whose entire civilization was built on the desperate search for survival, what the discovery meant. The C'tan could be given bodies. The Necrontyr's technology was advanced enough, despite their biological frailty, to accomplish engineering feats that would have been remarkable even by the Old One's standards. They developed necrodermis, living metal, a material that could repair itself, that could adapt to damage, that could serve as a vessel for something that had never before existed in physical form. They built bodies of necrodermis, and they offered these bodies to the C'tan. The C'tan accepted. The star vampires, which had existed for billions of years as formless energy, were given physical form. They stepped out of the stars and into the material universe, and the stepping changed them. The bodies gave them focus. The focus gave them hunger. The hunger, which had previously been directed at stellar radiation, now turned toward a far richer food source. Souls, life force. The psychic energy that living beings produced simply by existing, the emotional output of sentient species whose inner lives generated the very substance that the Imperium was made of. The C'tan, given bodies and given focus, discovered that living beings tasted better than stars. The Necrontyr had given gods to the galaxy, and the gods were hungry. But the Necrontyr did not care about what the C'tan ate, because the C'tan had offered them something in return. Something the Old Ones had refused. Immortality. The process was called biotransference. The Khitan designed it, or perhaps merely revealed it, drawing on knowledge that their billions of years of existence had accumulated in ways that biological species could not. Biotransference would transfer the consciousness of a living Necrontyr from its biological body into a body of necrodermis. The living metal that the Necrontyr had built for the Satan would now be built for the Necrontyr themselves. The flesh that was dying would be replaced by metal that did not die. The cells that were consuming themselves under their sun's radiation would be replaced by a material that repaired itself, that endured, that did not age or sicken or decay. The Necrontyr would become immortal. The dying would stop. The price was everything. Biotransference did not simply transfer consciousness into a new body. It stripped the consciousness of everything that made it alive. The emotions, the passions, the capacity for joy, for love, for the full spectrum of experience that a living being's inner life contains. The Necrontyr who underwent biotransference became something that had never existed before. Intelligent, aware, functional, capable of thought and action and the full range of cognitive operations that their biological brains had supported. But empty. Hollow, machines that remembered being alive and that could never feel alive again. The Necrons. They were not the Necrontyr anymore. The species that had raged against its biological death sentence had escaped the death, and the escape had cost them the life. They were immortal. They were also dead. Dead in every sense except the functional. Dead in the way that a body with no heartbeat and no breath and no warmth is dead, even though it continues to move and speak and fight. The Silent King, Sarek, the ruler of the Necrontyr's Triarch, the being who had authorized biotransference for his entire species, realized too late what the process had done. The Shaitan had not offered immortality. They had offered a different kind of death, slower and more complete than the death the Necrontyr's biology had threatened. The living metal bodies endured. The beings inside them had been consumed, their souls harvested by the Shaitan during the biotransference process itself. The life force of an entire species fed to the star vampires as the price of the shells that would house what remained. Sarek understood what had happened. He understood that the Necrontyr's bargain with the Khitan was the worst bargain in the history of intelligent life, and that the species he had been responsible for had been tricked into its own annihilation by beings whose hunger it had not understood. But the understanding came after the transformation. The Necrontyr were gone. The Necrons existed in their place, and the Necrons, with their new bodies and their Khitan masters, turned toward the old ones. The war in heaven was about to enter its second phase, and the second phase would be nothing like the first. The war in heaven. The Eldar call it by this name in their oldest legends, and the name carries the weight of everything it describes. A conflict fought not between armies on the surface of worlds, but between civilizations that commanded the forces of reality itself, whose weapons were stars and dimensions and the fundamental structure of the universe, whose battlefield was the entire Milky Way, and whose casualties were measured not in warriors but in species. The first phase of the war, the Necrontyr's original rebellion against the Old Ones, had been a mismatch. The Old Ones' mastery of the webway had made them untouchable. The Necrontyr's conventional technology could not match an enemy that could be anywhere in the galaxy in an instant, and the war had ended with the Necrontyr exiled to the Halo stars, defeated and forgotten. The second phase was different. The Necrons, the transformed Necrontyr, encased in necrodermis, animated by the remnants of their consumed consciousness, serving masters whose hunger was now directed at everything alive, attacked the old ones with capabilities the First War had not contained. The C'tan were the difference. The star gods, given physical form and focused hunger, possessed a command of the material universe that exceeded anything biological technology could produce. They did not simply wield weapons. They manipulated reality. Stars were extinguished. Planets were raised. Entire star systems were devoured by singularities, called into being by the C'tan's reality warping power. The Old Ones had never faced anything like this. Their mastery of the Imperium, the psychic dimension, the calm parallel realm they had built the webway through, was formidable. But the C'tan were creatures of the material universe. They had no connection to the Imperium, no vulnerability to psychic attack, no weakness in the dimension that the Old Ones had spent millennia learning to command. The C'tan fought in the material realm with the authority of beings that were as old as matter itself. And the Old Ones' psychic superiority could not counter an enemy that existed entirely outside the dimension their power operated in. The war ground forward. World after world fell to the Necron legions, backed by the C'tan whose presence on the battlefield was the presence of beings for whom the laws of physics were suggestions rather than constraints. The Necrons were relentless, machine warriors who did not tire, did not feel pain, did not retreat unless commanded to, and whose damaged bodies repaired themselves from the necrodermis that constituted their frames. An army that was not alive could not be demoralized. An army that repaired its own casualties could not be attrited. The Old Ones were fighting an enemy that was, in the most fundamental sense, already dead, and the dead did not stop. The C'tan fed as the war progressed. The life force of the conquered world's populations, the psychic energy that living beings produced through the act of being alive, was harvested by the star gods, who had discovered that the emotional output of sentient species was a far richer feast than the radiation of stars. Entire civilizations were consumed. The younger species that the Old Ones had nurtured and developed were slaughtered not for strategic reasons, but because the C'tan were hungry. And the slaughter fed the hunger, and the feeding made the C'tan stronger. The Old Ones' webway, the network that had been their greatest advantage in the First War, was breached. The C'tan called Nyadrazatha, the Burning One, had long desired to carry his fires into the realm beyond the material, and the Necron's technology provided the means. They built dolmen gates, portals that pierced the webway's boundaries and allowed Necron forces to enter the tunnels the Old Ones had built for instantaneous travel. The webway was no longer safe. The sanctuary that the Old Ones had used to outmaneuver their enemies was now a corridor through which those enemies could pursue them. The galaxy was being unmade. The civilization that had tended it for longer than most of the galaxy's current species have existed was being dismantled by an alliance of machine warriors and star gods whose combined capability exceeded anything the Old Ones had prepared for. The garden was burning. And the Old Ones, for the first time in their immense history, were afraid. The fear drove them to desperate measures that would produce consequences far worse than the war they were trying to win. The war in heaven is described in the sources as filling a library. This is not hyperbole. The conflict lasted for millennia, not the centuries that the Horus heresy consumed. not the decades that the Imperium's major campaigns typically span. Millennia. Thousands of standard years of sustained galaxy-wide conflict between civilizations whose capabilities exceeded anything the 41st millennium has witnessed. The scale resists comprehension in the same way the Old One's timescale resists it. To fight a war for thousands of years across the breadth of an entire galaxy, using weapons that extinguish stars and devour solar systems. This is not the kind of war that human experience provides the context to understand. The Horus heresy was devastating. The war in heaven was an order of magnitude beyond devastating. The heresy killed billions and broke the Imperium. The war in heaven killed everything and broke the dimension. The C'tan's weapons were not weapons in the conventional sense. They were expressions of the Star God's mastery of the material universe, the ability to manipulate the fundamental forces that the universe operates on. Gravity, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces that hold matter together. The C'tan could alter these forces as casually as a human might turn a knob. And the alteration produced effects that registered as weapons only because the effects were directed at targets the C'tan wished to destroy. A C'tan that wished to extinguish a star could extinguish a star. Not by firing a weapon at the star from across a battlefield, by changing the conditions under which the star operated, by altering the nuclear processes that sustained it, by reaching into the heart of the stellar furnace and rearranging the physics that made the furnace burn. The star went out, and the worlds that depended on it died, and the civilizations on those worlds died with them. And the C'tan fed on the psychic emissions of the dying. The Necrons' technology was proportional to their masters' capabilities. The Necron legions that marched against the Old One's bastions carried weapons whose principles the 41st millennium's military does not fully understand. Gauss weaponry that stripped matter from targets at the molecular level. Chronometric devices that manipulated local time flows. Dimensional shunts that removed targets from the material universe entirely. These weapons were not exotic curiosities, they were standard issue, distributed across Necron legions that numbered in the millions, deployed against fortified positions that the Old Ones had been building for longer than most species had existed. The Old Ones' defenses were equally beyond the 41st millennium's comprehension. The bastions they built, the fortress worlds, the webway nexuses, the dimensional strongholds that existed partially in the material universe and partially in the Imperium, were engineered to withstand assault from beings who could alter the fundamental forces of physics. They were psychically reinforced. They were dimensionally anchored. They were built by a civilization that had been preparing for the possibility of galactic war for longer than the Necrontyr had existed as a species. When these defenses met the C'tan's weapons, the results were cataclysmic. Worlds were not simply destroyed, they were unmade. Their physical substance consumed or scattered or transformed into something that was no longer recognizably matter. Star systems were not simply conquered, they were erased. Their stars extinguished and their planets devoured and their positions in the galaxy's geography removed as completely as though they had never existed. The collateral damage was the galaxy itself. The gravitational disruptions produced by the C'tan's stellar manipulations altered the orbits of worlds across sectors. The dimensional breaches produced by the conflict's most intense engagements created regions of space where the barrier between the material universe and the Imperium was permanently thinned. producing the warp-vulnerable areas that the 41st millennium calls warp storms. The biological devastation, the extinction of species, the sterilization of worlds, the consumption of entire biospheres by the C'tan's hunger reduced the galaxy's biodiversity by a magnitude that 60 million years of subsequent evolution has not fully replaced. The galaxy's current geography bears the scars. The maelstrom, the eye of terror, the regions of space where the warp bleeds into the material universe with particular intensity. Some of these may be natural features of the galaxy's structure. Some of them may be the wounds that the war in heaven inflicted, never fully healed, still bleeding across the dimensional barrier 60 million years after the blow that opened them was struck. The warriors who fought in this conflict, the Eldar, the Krork, the other species the Old Ones created as weapons, fought at scales that their descendants in the 41st millennium cannot match. The Eldar of the War in Heaven era were not the diminished, desperate, fractured remnant that the craftworld Eldari have become. They were a freshly created species at the peak of the capability their creators had designed into them, wielding the warp's energies with a power and a sophistication that millions of years of subsequent development have not duplicated. The Krork of the War in Heaven era were not the Orcs. They were the full, undiminished, maintained version of the biological warfare platform the Old Ones had engineered, larger than the current era Orcs, more intelligent, more technologically sophisticated, possessed of the psychic gestalt at the level of power the Old Ones had designed, rather than the degraded version that 60 million years of unsupervised operation has produced. A Krork warrior of the War in Heaven era would have dwarfed a modern Orc war boss, and the difference in combat capability between the two would have been proportional. These forces clashed across the galaxy for millennia, against enemies whose weapons could extinguish stars and whose soldiers were immortal machines. The fighting produced the suffering that corrupted the Imperium. The corruption produced the entities that would eventually become the Chaos Gods. The entities produced the enslavers that would finally break the Old Ones' remaining defenses. Everything connected, everything consequential, everything from the first blow struck by the Necrontyr's initial rebellion to the last Old One's disappearance from the galaxy, linked in a chain of cause and effect that has been running for 60 million years and that shows no sign of reaching its conclusion. The War in Heaven was not the 41st millennium's ancient history. It is the 41st millennium's ongoing condition. The war never ended. It changed. It evolved. It produced new combatants and new weapons and new stakes. But the fundamental conflict between order and entropy, between civilization and the forces that tear civilization apart, between the builders and the destroyers, is the same conflict the Old Ones fought. The galaxy has been fighting the same war for 60 million years. It has not won yet. The Old Ones had always created life. It was what they did, the gardeners of the galaxy, seeding worlds with organisms, nurturing developing species, guiding evolution along paths that their immense intelligence and patience allowed them to envision across timescales that shorter-lived species could not comprehend. But the life they had created before the war was created for the garden, for the project, for the long, patient work of building a galaxy that was diverse and interconnected, and capable of sustaining the kinds of civilizations the Old Ones believed should exist. The life they had created before the war was nurtured, The life they created during the war was weaponized. The Old Ones' understanding of the Imperium gave them a critical insight into the C'tan's weakness. The star gods were creatures of the material universe. They had no connection to the warp, no ability to operate in the psychic realm, no defense against attacks that originated from outside material reality. The C'tan's power was absolute within the reality they inhabited, but there was a realm they did not inhabit, and that realm contained energies that the C'tan could not counter. If the Old Ones could create species with a strong connection to the warp, species whose psychic capabilities would allow them to channel the Imperium's energies as weapons, those species could fight the C'tan on terms the star gods were not equipped to handle. The C'tan's material supremacy would be met by psychic superiority. The war would be fought across 2 dimensions simultaneously, and in the realm where the C'tan were vulnerable, the Old Ones' creations would have the advantage. The theory was sound. The execution would produce the Eldar. The Eldar were engineered, not evolved, not developed over millions of years through the gradual processes that natural selection employs. Engineered, designed by the Old Ones as a species whose fundamental biology was oriented toward the warp, whose psychic potential was embedded in their genetic structure at the deepest level, whose connection to the Imperium was not a learned skill but an inherent quality of their existence. Every Eldar, from the moment of birth, was a psyker. Not the rare, dangerous, individually manifesting psychic capability that human psykers represent. A species-wide, genetically encoded relationship with the realm the C'tan could not touch. The Eldar were beautiful. They were graceful. They were intelligent, creative, emotionally complex, and possessed of lifespans that, while not matching the Old Ones' immense longevity, extended across millennia. These qualities were not accidents. They were design choices. The Old Ones built a species that would be formidable in war and capable of civilization after the war. A species that could serve as soldiers and then as heirs. A creation that was meant to fight the current enemy and then inherit the garden when the current gardeners could no longer tend it. The Eldar fought. They fought alongside the Old Ones as their most capable allies, channeling the warp's energies against the C'tan with a psychic ferocity that the star gods had never encountered. The Eldar's connection to the Imperium gave them access to powers that operated outside the C'tan's area of supremacy, and the surprise of this, the sudden appearance of weapons the C'tan had not been designed to resist, produced results that the conventional war had not. But the Eldar alone were not enough. The C'tan and the Necrons were too powerful, too numerous, too relentless for a single created species to counter. The Old Ones needed more. They created the Krork. Where the Eldar were elegant, the Krork were brutal. Where the Eldar's power came from the warp, the Krork's power came from biology. The most aggressively optimized biological warfare platform the Old Ones could design. The Krork were massive, green-skinned, physically formidable, and possessed of a reproductive system that was, from a military perspective, the most efficient ever conceived. They reproduced through spores. They grew from the ground. A Krork force that took casualties replaced those casualties from the biological material of the dead, friend and foe alike. And the replacement was automatic, requiring no medical infrastructure, no training program, no logistics. The Krork were designed to fight forever. This was their purpose. not to win a single war, but to prosecute continuous warfare without the logistical constraints that limited every other military force in the galaxy. A Krork population, left to its own devices, would fight, reproduce, grow, fight again, and continue the cycle indefinitely. The Old Ones had built a weapon that generated its own ammunition. They also built into the Krork a psychic capability that was different from the Eldar's. The Krork's psychic connection to the warp was not conscious, not the deliberate, trained, individually directed power that the Eldar wielded. It was collective, subconscious, a gestalt psychic field generated by large numbers of Krork operating in proximity, which produced effects that individual Krork were not aware they were causing. A Krork's weapon worked because the Krork believed it would work, and the belief generated a psychic field that made the weapon function regardless of its mechanical soundness. The technology was powered by faith, not religious faith, but the absolute, unquestioning conviction that the thing in the Krork's hand was a weapon, and that the weapon would kill. This was insane. This was the product of a civilization that was losing a war against gods, and that had reached the point where the solutions it designed were as dangerous as the problems they were designed to solve. The Krork's self-perpetuating biological warfare and their subconscious psychic capability made them devastating weapons against the Necrons and the C'tan. They also made the Krork effectively impossible to control, because a species that reproduces from spores and that fights because fighting is its biological imperative does not stop fighting when the war it was created for is over. The Old Ones knew this. They created the Krork anyway, because the alternative was losing the war in heaven, and losing the war in heaven meant losing everything. Other species were created during this period as well. The Jokero, small simian creatures with an instinctive ability to manipulate technology, capable of constructing devices that defied conventional engineering without apparently understanding the principles their constructions operated on. The Rud, a mysterious, time-warping species whose relationship to the Old Ones is documented in fragments. The Khanib and the Rashan, warrior races whose names survive in the Eldar's oldest legends, but whose nature is no longer known. Each of these creations was a weapon. Each was designed to address a dimension of the war in heaven that the Old Ones' existing capabilities could not. Each was released into the galaxy with the urgency of a civilization that was running out of time and that needed every advantage it could produce, regardless of the long-term consequences of producing it. The consequences were coming, and the consequences would be worse than the war. The Imperium had been calm. It is necessary to repeat this, because the magnitude of what the war in heaven did to it is the most consequential event in the history of the galaxy, and the event is only comprehensible against the baseline that preceded it. The Imperium, the dimension that would become the warp, was a realm of formless psychic energy, not hostile, not predatory, not the seething nightmare of demonic entities and corrupted power that the 41st millennium knows. It was a mirror, a dimension that reflected the psychic emissions of the galaxy's sentient species, that absorbed their emotional output, that existed in a state of passive correspondence with the material universe. The Old Ones had used this calm dimension as the medium for the webway. They had built structures in it. They had navigated it safely. They had treated the Imperium as a resource, as a tool, as a dimension that could be shaped and used by a species with the intelligence to understand its properties. The war in heaven changed the Imperium. The war changed it because the war flooded it with the psychic emissions of suffering, rage, terror, and death on a scale that the dimension had never absorbed before. The war in heaven killed billions, not billions of individuals, billions of civilizations. The Catan devoured worlds. The Necron legions exterminated populations. The Old One's warrior races fought with a ferocity that the Garden had never experienced. The scale of violence was galactic, not concentrated on a few worlds or a few systems, but spread across the breadth of the Milky Way, sustained across millennia, producing suffering at a volume that the Imperium could not process without being transformed by it. Every death produced a psychic emission. Every moment of terror, every scream of pain, every act of violence, each generated a pulse of psychic energy that bled into the Imperium and added to the cumulative charge that the dimension was accumulating. The sentient species that the Old Ones had created, the Eldar, the Krork, the other races designed with heightened warp connections, were especially prolific emitters. Their emotions were stronger, their psychic presence was more intense. The suffering they experienced and inflicted produced correspondingly larger ripples in the dimension that their biology was connected to. The Imperium absorbed all of it. And the absorption changed it. The formless energy became less formless. The psychic charge that the war produced began to coalesce, to organize, to develop patterns that reflected the emotions driving them. Rage accumulated into concentrations of aggressive energy. Fear accumulated into regions of predatory awareness. The calm dimension began to develop currents, eddies, areas of intensified activity that corresponded to the galactic regions where the war was most intense. The entities appeared. Not the Chaos Gods, not yet. The entities that emerged in the corrupting Imperium during the war in heaven were lesser things, born from the concentrated psychic emissions of the war's violence. Predatory psychic organisms, drawn to the sentient minds that produced the emissions they fed on, pressing against the barriers between the Imperium and the material universe with a hunger that the barriers had not been built to withstand. These entities grew. They evolved, not biologically but psychically, adapting to the dimensional environment that the war's emissions were creating, developing capabilities that the calm Imperium's conditions had not supported. They became more intelligent, more aggressive, more capable of reaching through the thinning barriers between dimensions. And then the enslavers arrived. The enslavers were the worst of the Imperium's new inhabitants. Psychophagic entities, beings that fed on psychic energy directly, that could dominate the minds of psychers and use the possessed individual as a portal, a gateway through which the enslaver could cross from the Imperium into the material universe. Every psyker was a potential doorway. Every psychically sensitive species that the Old Ones had created, the Eldar, the other warrior races, was a population of doorways. The enslavers poured through, on world after world, across the galaxy's war-torn geography. The psychers that the Old Ones had created as weapons against the Catan became weapons against the Old Ones themselves, possessed, transformed, used as biological gateways for entities that consumed the minds that generated them. The Old Ones' own creations, the species designed with enhanced warp connections. The warrior races whose psychic sensitivity was supposed to be their greatest advantage became the medium through which the Imperium's new predators invaded the material universe. The Old Ones faced a war on 3 fronts. The Catan and the Necrons pressed from the material side. The Enslavers pressed from the immaterial side, and the warp itself, the dimension that had been the Old One's greatest asset, the calm medium through which the webway operated, the foundation of their entire civilizational infrastructure, was transforming into the enemy. The webway was breached from within, not by the Necrons' dolmen gates which attacked from outside, but by the Enslavers, which attacked from the Imperium itself. From the dimension the webway was built through, the medium that the tunnels passed through, the very substance that the webway's walls were supposed to protect its travelers from. The Enslavers did not need gates. They were already inside the dimension the webway occupied. They pressed on the tunnel's boundaries from every direction simultaneously. The Old Ones destroyed their own warp gates to prevent the contamination from spreading. They collapsed sections of the webway, severing connections between regions to contain the enslaver infestation. They sacrificed pieces of the network they had spent millennia building, because the network had become a vector for the plague it was supposed to protect against. This was the moment the Old Ones' civilization ended. Not the moment of their physical destruction that was still coming, still grinding forward through the war's final terrible years. The moment their civilization ended was the moment they began destroying the webway. Because the webway was their civilization, it was the thing that connected them, that made their galaxy-spanning project possible, that allowed the gardeners to tend the garden. Without the webway, the Old Ones were isolated, individual strongholds, cut off from each other, fighting separate wars against enemies that attacked from every dimension simultaneously. The calm Imperium was gone. In its place was something that would eventually be called the Warp, a dimension of corrupted psychic energy, populated by predatory entities, hostile to everything that entered it, and growing more hostile with every sentient being that suffered and died in the war that was still raging across the galaxy. The Old Ones had not created the warp deliberately. They had created the conditions that created the warp, the psychically enhanced species whose emissions fed the corruption, the war whose violence produced the emissions, the refusal to grant the Necrontyr's petition that had started the chain of events leading to the war. The warp was a consequence, a side effect, the unintended product of a civilization fighting for survival with weapons whose collateral damage was the corruption of a dimension the civilization depended on. The irony is absolute. The Old Ones' greatest asset, the Imperium, the calm dimension they had mastered, became their greatest enemy because the war they were fighting to protect it contaminated it. They poisoned their own water supply. They set fire to their own house. They turned the foundation of their power into the instrument of their destruction. And the corruption is permanent. 60 million years later, the warp is still the warp. The chaos gods that eventually coalesced from the corrupted dimension are still there. The daemons that press against the barrier between dimensions are still pressing. The Imperium that was once calm is a screaming nightmare from which there is no awakening. The Old Ones did this. Not alone, not deliberately. But the chain of causes that produced the warp as the galaxy knows it begins with the Old Ones' refusal to help the Necrontyr, passes through the war in heaven, flows through the creation of the psychically enhanced warrior races, and arrives at the corruption of the medium that was supposed to be the galaxy's greatest resource. Every daemon that has ever existed, every chaos god that has ever been worshipped, every act of psychic corruption, every warp storm, every moment of chaos spawned horror across 60 million years of galactic history. All of it traces back to the moment when the calm Imperium absorbed too much suffering and began to change. The Old Ones did not intend this. But intention does not determine consequences. And the consequences have been running for 60 million years. The Old Ones died in the dark, not in a single battle, not in a climactic confrontation that the galaxy's subsequent mythologies could point to as the moment the age ended. The Old Ones' civilization did not fall with the dramatic finality that the Elder Empire would later experience when Slaanesh was born, or that the Imperium nearly experienced when the heresy brought it to the edge of destruction. The Old Ones' fall was gradual. It was dispersed. It was the slow, grinding attrition of a civilization whose foundations had been removed and whose structure was collapsing piecemeal, system by system, stronghold by stronghold, across the breadth of a galaxy that was no longer their garden. The webway was gone, or rather, it was no longer theirs. Sections had been destroyed by the Old Ones themselves to prevent enslaver contamination. Sections had been breached by the Necron's dolmen gates. Sections had been corrupted by the warp's transformation from the calm Imperium into the hostile entity-filled dimension it was becoming. The network that had connected the Old Ones' civilization was fractured, and without the network the Old Ones were isolated, individual bastions fighting individual wars, without the coordination that had been their greatest strategic advantage. The Catan continued to feed. The star gods, glutted on the life force of the galaxy's populations, grew more powerful as the war progressed. By the war's closing stages, only a handful of Satan remained. They had begun feeding on each other, the smaller consumed by the larger, the weaker absorbed by the stronger, the process of concentration producing a smaller number of entities of staggering individual power. The four that survived this cannibalistic consolidation were among the most powerful beings the galaxy had ever contained. The Necron legions pressed the assault with the mechanical inevitability that their nature demanded. They did not grow tired. They did not grow demoralized. They did not reach the point of exhaustion that biological armies reach after sustained campaigning. The Necrons simply continued. Battle after battle, world after world, century after century, the machine warriors advanced through the ruins of the Old Ones' civilization, with the relentless patience of things that had eternity to complete the task. The Old Ones' warrior races fought. The Eldar, the Krork, the other created species, they fought with the capabilities their creators had given them, channeling the warp's corrupted energies against the Catan, meeting the Necron legions on the surface of worlds that were being consumed by the war. The warrior races were effective. They slowed the advance. They destroyed Necron forces that could be destroyed. They harassed the Catan in ways that the star gods had not anticipated. But the warrior races could not save their creators. The Old Ones' civilization was too badly damaged, too fragmented, too isolated, too beset from every direction for any amount of military success to reverse the collapse. The war had moved past the point where military victories mattered, because the foundations that military victories were supposed to protect had already been destroyed. The Old One's bastions fell, one by one. The strongholds that had been the anchors of their galactic civilization, the places of power, the centers of knowledge, the repositories of the technology and wisdom that a species measured in geological timescales had accumulated, were overwhelmed. Overwhelmed by Necrons from the material side, overwhelmed by enslavers from the immaterial side, overwhelmed by the simple grinding mathematics of a war fought on too many fronts with too few resources, by a civilization whose greatest asset, the webway, had been turned into a liability. What happened to the Old Ones when their bastions fell is the galaxy's first great mystery. They may have died. All of them. Every member of the species that had been the first intelligent civilization in the galaxy, destroyed in the war they had started by refusing the Necrontyr's petition, their biological material consumed by the Catan, their psychic presence absorbed by the corrupting Imperium, their physical remains lost in the wreckage of worlds that were themselves destroyed. They may have fled. Some accounts, preserved in the deepest layers of Eldar mythology, in the whispered traditions of species whose knowledge predates human civilization by millions of years, suggest that some Old Ones survived, that they fled the galaxy, departing through webway passages that led to dimensions or locations beyond the Milky Way, carrying with them whatever they could save of their civilization's knowledge and technology. If this is true, the Old Ones are still out there somewhere, beyond the galaxy's edge, in a dimension the current civilizations have not reached, waiting or rebuilding or simply existing in whatever state their survival has permitted. They may have ascended. Some theories not widely supported by the available evidence, but persistent in the scholarly traditions that attempt to reconstruct the galaxy's ancient history, suggest that the Old Ones' mastery of the Imperium allowed them to transcend physical existence entirely. That they became beings of pure psychic energy, departing the material realm for the Imperium, and existing there in a state that the warp's corruption may or may not have been able to touch. If this is true, the Old Ones are not gone. They are in the warp, somewhere, in a form that the galaxy's current inhabitants cannot perceive. None of these possibilities can be confirmed. The Old Ones are gone, from the material galaxy, from the historical record, from everything except the consequences they left behind. They are gone, and the going has been complete enough that 60 million years of subsequent history have not produced a verified account of what happened to them. What can be said is this: the galaxy that the Old Ones left behind was ruined. The webway was fractured. The Imperium was corrupted. The species the Old Ones had created were orphaned, released into a galaxy that was no longer tended, no longer gardened, no longer maintained by the intelligence that had shaped it. The garden was abandoned, and gardens that are abandoned do not simply maintain themselves. They grow wild. The Old Ones were gone, and the victors turned on each other. This is the specific curse of the war in heaven. A conflict so destructive that it consumed not only the losing side, but the winning one. The Ciatan and the Necrons had destroyed the galaxy's first civilization. They stood as the dominant force in a galaxy that had been emptied of everything that had opposed them. And in the power vacuum that the Old Ones' destruction created, the alliance that had destroyed them could not hold. the Silent King acted. Sarek, the ruler of the Necrontyr, the being who had authorized biotransference, who had watched his species lose its souls in exchange for immortal bodies that could not feel, had carried the guilt of his decision across the entire war in heaven. The war had been won. The old ones were gone. The galaxy belonged to the Necrons and their Catan masters, and the belonging was hollow, because the species that had won the war was no longer the species that had started it. The Necrontyr who had raged against their biological death sentence were gone. The Necrons who existed in their place were machines, aware, functional, immortal, and dead in every way that mattered. The Catan had done this. The star gods who had offered immortality and delivered annihilation, who had consumed the Necrontyr's souls during biotransference, who had used the Necrontyr's rage as the fuel for a war whose primary beneficiaries were the Satan themselves. These beings were now the Necron's masters. And Sarek understood, with the cold clarity that his machine consciousness provided, that the masters must be overthrown. The revolt was coordinated across the entire Necron civilization. Sarek had been planning it for the duration of the war, working in the silence that the Catan, absorbed in their feasting, had not monitored closely enough. When the revolt came, it came from everywhere simultaneously. The full military might of the galaxy's most formidable machine civilization turned against the beings who had consumed them. But the fall's origins trace back further than the Eldar's own choices. They trace back to the Old Ones. The Old Ones designed the Eldar with a profound connection to the warp. This was deliberate. The connection was the Eldar's primary weapon against the Catan, the channel through which they could direct the Imperium's energies against beings that existed entirely in the material realm. The psychic sensitivity that made the Eldar formidable warriors also made them susceptible to the warp's influence in ways that the Old Ones may not have fully anticipated. The warp that the Old Ones knew was calm. The psychic sensitivity they built into the Eldar was designed for a calm dimension, a stable environment, a medium that could be safely channeled and directed. The warp that the Eldar inherited was not calm. It was the corrupted, entity-filled, emotionally reflective nightmare that the war in heaven had produced. The psychic sensitivity that was an asset in a calm Imperium became a liability in a corrupted one, because the Eldar's emotions fed the warp with a richness and an intensity that no other species could match. The Old Ones gave the Eldar the gift that would eventually destroy them. Not out of malice. Out of the gap between the conditions the gift was designed for and the conditions the gift would actually operate in. The Old Ones could not have known, could not have predicted, across the gulf of time that separated the Eldar's creation from the Eldar's fall, that the dimension they had mastered would be corrupted, and that the corruption would turn their finest creation's greatest gift into the instrument of its annihilation. But the chain of causes is unbroken. The Old Ones created the Eldar with a deep warp connection. The war in heaven corrupted the warp. The corrupted warp amplified the Eldar's emotions. The amplified emotions produced the decadence. The decadence produced the fall. The fall produced Slaanesh. Slaanesh exists because the Old Ones built the Eldar the way they built them. The youngest Chaos God is, in this sense, the Old One's grandchild, born from the corruption of a dimension the Old Ones mastered, through a species the Old Ones created, via a psychic sensitivity the Old Ones designed. The chain is 60 million years long. It has never been broken. The Krork were built to fight forever, They did, not as the Krork. The species the Old Ones had created, the massive green-skinned warriors with subconscious psychic capability and spore-based reproduction, did not survive the war in heaven intact. The Krork degraded. The word is imprecise, but no better word exists for what happened to a species that was designed to be maintained by its creators and that was left to develop on its own when the creators disappeared. The Old Ones had built the Krork to a specification that required oversight. The psychic gestalt that powered the Krork's technology was supposed to be guided, channeled, directed, maintained at the level of capability that the Old One's engineering had intended. The Krork's biological warfare platform was supposed to be managed, the reproductive cycles calibrated, the population growth controlled, the species development steered toward the outcomes the Old Ones required. Without the Old Ones, none of this happened. The Krork were released into a galaxy that no longer contained the beings who were supposed to maintain them, and the species began to drift. The psychic gestalt, unguided, became cruder. The technology that the Krork produced through their subconscious psychic field became less sophisticated, less reliable, more dependent on the raw intensity of belief rather than the structured capability the Old Ones had designed. The warriors became smaller. The intelligence declined. The sophistication that the Krork had possessed as a design species, the strategic capability, the coordinated warfare, the technological proficiency, degraded across the millennia into something simpler, rawer, less controlled. The Krork became the Orcs. The Orcs are the Krork's descendants. The relationship is visible in the biology, the green skin, the spore-based reproduction, the subconscious psychic field that makes Orc technology function through collective belief rather than mechanical principle. But the Orcs are the Krork degraded, the war machine running without maintenance. The weapon that continues to fire long after the war it was built for has ended, firing at everything in every direction, because the weapon no longer has a target and the firing is the only thing it knows how to do. The Orcs are the galaxy's most prolific military force. They exist on every continent of every world they have reached, and they have reached most of the worlds in the galaxy. They fight constantly, not for territory, not for resources, not for any strategic objective that a rational military analysis could identify. They fight because fighting is their biological imperative. The Old Ones designed them to fight, and the imperative has survived 60 million years of unsupervised operation. The Warg is the Krork's legacy at its most visible and its most destructive. A Warg is an Orc mass migration and military campaign driven by the species' collective psychic field, which generates a cascade of violence that pulls every Orc within range into its orbit. The Warg grows. It feeds on itself. The violence produces excitement, and the excitement intensifies the psychic field, and the intensified field produces more violence, and the cycle continues until the Warg either burns itself out or collides with something strong enough to stop it. Nothing in the Old One's design intended this. The Krork psychic field was supposed to be a weapon, a directed, managed capability that the Old Ones could aim at the Catan. The Warg is the weapon running without direction, generating its own targets from whatever is available, producing a self-sustaining cycle of violence that the galaxy has been unable to eliminate in 60 million years, because the biological platform that generates it is effectively indestructible. The Orcs cannot be exterminated. Their spore-based reproduction means that any world an orc has set foot on will eventually produce more orcs. The spores survive environmental conditions that would kill any conventional organism. They lodge in soil, in crevices, in the biological material of the world's ecosystem. And they wait. Months, years, decades. The spores are patient, in the way that a mechanism is patient, waiting for conditions that trigger the growth cycle and producing a new generation of orcs that will immediately begin fighting whatever is available to fight. The old ones designed this. They designed a species that could not be eliminated by any enemy, that would replace its casualties from the biological material of the battlefield, that would persist indefinitely regardless of the losses inflicted on it. This was the Krork's purpose, to be the weapon that never ran out of ammunition, the army that could not be attrited, the force that would fight the Necrons and the Citan forever if necessary. The war ended. The weapon did not. Every orc war that has ever threatened the Imperium, every world overrun, every civilization destroyed, every Imperial Guard regiment ground into paste by the green tide, is the Old One's weapon continuing to function 60 million years after the war it was built for. Every planetary governor who has watched an orc invasion consume the world they were responsible for has been killed by a 60 million year old biological weapon that nobody is maintaining and that nobody can turn off. The Old Ones created the orcs to save the galaxy. The orcs have spent 60 million years demonstrating what happens when a weapon of galactic salvation is left running after the war is over. The galaxy has been unable to stop them. The galaxy may never be able to stop them. The weapon is still firing. This is the Old One's legacy in its most brutal form. The Eldar and the Krork are the Old One's most famous creations. They are not the only one. The galaxy contains other species whose origins trace back to the war in heaven. Species created or modified by the Old Ones for purposes that the war demanded, and that have persisted in various states of degradation and adaptation across the 60 million years since their creators disappeared. The Jokero are among the most remarkable. Small simian creatures, superficially resembling the orangutans of old Earth. A coincidence that has produced centuries of confused xenobiological classification. The Jokero possess an innate ability to manipulate technology that defies conventional understanding. A Jokero can construct devices of extraordinary sophistication from components that should not be sufficient to produce them. It can modify weapons, build communication equipment, fabricate defensive systems, and create technological artifacts that Imperial artificers would spend years attempting to replicate. And it does all of this without any apparent understanding of the engineering principles its constructions operate on. The Jokero do not learn technology. They express it the way an instinct is expressed, without conscious awareness of the process, without the analytical understanding that most species require to produce technological innovation. The capability is biological. It is embedded in the Jokero's genetics, placed there by the Old Ones for purposes that the available records do not fully explain. The most likely explanation is that the Jokero were created as the Old Ones' technological maintenance species, beings whose instinctive engineering capability would maintain the Old Ones' infrastructure, without requiring the kind of education and training that a conventional maintenance workforce would need. The Jokero could repair the webway's physical components, construct replacement parts for damaged installations, modify equipment to meet new requirements, all without being taught, all through a biological capability that the Old Ones had designed into their genetics, with the same thoroughness they brought to the Eldar's psychic sensitivity, and the Krork's biological warfare platform. Without the Old Ones to direct them, the Jokero's capability has continued, but without the purpose that the Old Ones would have provided. The Jokero build because building is their biological imperative, in the same way that fighting is the Orc's biological imperative. They build without strategic direction, without long-term planning, without the kind of institutional memory that would allow their constructions to accumulate into a civilization. Each Jokero builds in isolation, producing artifacts of extraordinary quality that serve no larger purpose, and that are not integrated into any larger project. The Imperium uses the Jokero when it can capture and contain them, employing the creature's instinctive engineering capability to produce equipment that the Mechanicus cannot replicate, tolerating the unpredictability of a species that builds what it wants to build rather than what it is asked to build, accepting the risk that a Jokero's construction might be brilliant, or might be dangerous, or might be both simultaneously. The Hrud are a different kind of legacy, a species whose nature is poorly understood by the Imperium, and deliberately so, since the Hrud's primary capability is one that makes study extraordinarily difficult. The Hrud distort time. Their presence produces a localized temporal field that accelerates the passage of time for everything in their vicinity. A warrior who enters a Hrud's presence ages, not metaphorically. His body's biological clock accelerates. His cells age at increased speed. His lifespan is consumed by the temporal distortion that the Hrud generates simply by existing. This is a weapon. The Old Ones designed it as a weapon. A species whose mere proximity degraded the enemy's military capability by aging the enemy's soldiers, corroding the enemy's equipment, producing the effects of centuries of wear in minutes. Against the Necrons, whose machine bodies do not age and whose necrodermis repairs itself, the weapon was less effective than the Old Ones had intended. Against biological opponents, the Hrud's temporal distortion was devastating. The Hrud have survived the 60 million years since the Old One's disappearance by existing at the margins. They are not numerous. They are not powerful in the conventional military sense. They persist in the dark places, in the forgotten corners of the galaxy, in the spaces between civilizations where their temporal distortion can operate without attracting the kind of attention that would produce a military response. The Imperium classifies them as Xenos vermin, to be exterminated when encountered, and the classification is not wrong from the Imperium's perspective. The Hrud's temporal field is genuinely dangerous to human populations, and the species has no interest in coexistence that the Imperium's institutional categories can accommodate. The Khnib and the Rashan are names that survive in the Eldar's oldest legends, and in almost nothing else. Warrior species, created by the Old Ones during the War in Heaven, whose nature and capabilities are no longer known, because the species themselves may no longer exist. Their names persist, because the Eldar remember, and the Eldar's memory extends back to the era when these species fought alongside the Old Ones against the Khatan, in wars whose specific engagements are beyond reconstruction, but whose general shape is preserved in the mythological traditions that the craft world farseers maintain. Whether the Khnib and the Rashan are truly extinct, whether the war in heaven and its aftermath eliminated them completely, or whether remnant populations persist in the galaxy's unexplored regions, is unknown. The galaxy is large. Extinction is difficult to confirm across a volume of space that no single civilization has fully surveyed. Species that are believed to be extinct sometimes turn out to be merely hidden, and the Old One's creations were designed by a civilization that valued concealment. Each of these lesser creations is a thread in the tapestry the Old Ones wove. Each represents a decision the Old Ones made during the war in heaven, a capability they needed, a function they required, a gap in their military or logistical or technical capacity that they addressed through the creation of a new species designed to fill it. Each has survived the Old One's disappearance and developed in its own direction, shaped by 60 million years of unsupervised existence into something the Old Ones might not recognize as their creation. The Jokero build, the Rud corrode, the Orcs fight, the Eldar navigate the dying webway. Each species carries a piece of the Old Ones' legacy, a fragment of the civilization that created them, a function that was designed for a war that ended 60 million years ago, but that the species continues to perform, because the function is embedded in their biology, and the biology does not know the war is over. The galaxy is populated by the Old One's children. The children do not know their parents. The parents are gone. The children persist, carrying the gifts and the curses that the parents bestowed, fighting the wars that the parents' decisions produced, living in the consequences of choices that were made before any of them existed. This is what it means to be created rather than evolved. The created species carries its creator's purpose. The evolved species develops its own. The difference between the two is the difference between the galaxy's engineered inhabitants and the galaxy's one major species that the Old Ones did not engineer. Humanity was not engineered. Humanity developed its own purpose. Whether that purpose is compatible with the Old One's legacy, whether a species that was not designed for the garden can tend a garden that was designed by someone else, is the question that the 41st millennium is asking. Humanity was not one of the Old One's weapons. This distinction matters, because the distinction determines what humanity is in the context of the Old One's legacy, and what humanity is determines whether the species has a future that the Old Ones did not design. The available evidence suggests that the Old Ones visited Terra, that they seeded life on the planet, not humanity directly, not the species that would eventually produce the Imperium and the Emperor and the Space Marines, but the early, tree-dwelling, primate-like ancestors from which humanity would eventually evolve. The Old Ones planted the seed. They did not tend the garden. They moved on, leaving the seed to develop in its own way, on its own timeline, without the guidance or the interference that the Old Ones provided to the species they were actively engineering. Humanity was a project that the Old Ones started and did not finish. A species left in the earliest stages of development, abandoned when the Old Ones disappeared, developing across millions of years through natural processes that the Old Ones' departure had allowed to proceed without the intervention that would have shaped the development differently. This makes humanity unique among the galaxy's intelligent species. The Eldar were engineered to specification. The Krork were built as weapons. The Jokero were designed as technical specialists. Every major species that the Old Ones actively developed was created with a purpose, shaped toward a function, designed to serve a role in the garden that the Old Ones were building. Humanity was not designed for a purpose. Humanity developed its own purpose across millions of years of unsupervised evolution, arriving at sentience and then at civilization, and then at interstellar capability through processes that the Old Ones did not direct. Whatever humanity is, whatever the Emperor represents, whatever the Imperium has become, whatever the species' relationship to the warp and to chaos and to the galaxy's other inhabitants amounts to, it is not the product of the Old One's design. It is the product of what happens when the Old One's seed is left to grow without the gardener's guidance. This has implications. If the Old One's engineered species carry the flaws of their engineering, if the Eldar's warp sensitivity and the Orc's biological imperative toward violence are consequences of design choices that the Old Ones made for purposes that are no longer relevant, then humanity's lack of engineering might be an advantage. Humanity does not carry a designer's intention. It does not have a purpose embedded in its biology by a species that has been extinct for 60 million years. It is free, in a way that the Eldar and the Orcs are not, to become whatever its own choices produce. The Emperor may have understood this. The being who united humanity and launched the Great Crusade and built the Imperium, a being whose origins are shrouded in a mystery that rivals the Old One's own, may have recognized that humanity's value lay precisely in its independence from the Old One's designs. The Emperor's Imperial Webway project, the attempt to build a human-controlled passage through the Imperium, using technology that the Emperor developed independently or that was derived from the Old One's own, was, in this reading, an attempt to give humanity the same advantage the Old Ones had possessed without the dependence on the Old One's legacy that using the Eldar's webway would have created. Whether the Emperor was himself connected to the Old Ones, whether the being who sits on the golden throne was created by the Old Ones, or derived from their technology, or was simply a human being of extraordinary psychic capability whose relationship to the Old Ones is coincidental rather than causal, is one of the 41st millennium's most closely guarded mysteries. The Emperor does not discuss his origins. The Inquisition classifies any investigation of the Emperor's nature as heresy of the most dangerous kind. The question is unanswerable from the evidence available to the Imperium's scholars. What can be said is that the Emperor's project, the unification of humanity, the Great Crusade, the Imperial Webway, follows the same general pattern as the Old One's civilization. Unify the galaxy. Build a webway. Protect and develop the species under your care. The parallels are not exact, and drawing them too precisely risks the kind of heresy that the Inquisition exists to suppress. But the parallels are visible, and the visibility raises the question of whether the Emperor was, consciously or not, attempting to rebuild what the Old Ones had built, to create a second version of the galactic civilization that the war in heaven had destroyed, using humanity as the species that would maintain it. If this is true, the Emperor's project was the Old One's project continued by other means. And the project's failure, the heresy, the Emperor's entombment on the Golden Throne, the 10,000 years of decline that followed, was the Old One's project failing for the second time. The galaxy does not appear to be kind to civilizations that attempt to garden it. The Old Ones tried and were destroyed. The Eldar tried and fell to their own excess. The Emperor tried and was broken by his own sons. The pattern suggests that the galaxy resists stewardship, that the forces arrayed against any civilization that attempts to impose order on the cosmos are stronger than the civilization's ability to maintain the imposition. Or the pattern suggests that the attempts have been wrong, that the Old One's approach was flawed, and the Eldar's approach was flawed, and the Emperor's approach was flawed, and the flaw is common to all three but has not yet been identified. Humanity is still trying. The Imperium persists, damaged and declining but persistent, fighting the same fights the Old Ones fought against the same fundamental enemies. Whether humanity will find the flaw, correct it and build the galactic civilization that the Old Ones could not, is the question that the 41st millennium is in the process of answering. The answer is not yet clear. The webway survives. Of everything the Old Ones built, every species they created, every world they seeded, every technology they developed across the immense span of their civilization, the webway is the one creation that remains functional. Damaged, diminished, partially collapsed, infested with things that the Old Ones would never have permitted inside it. But functional. 60 million years after the civilization that created it was destroyed, the tunnels through the Imperium still connect the galaxy's worlds. This is, by any measure, the most impressive feat of engineering in the galaxy's history. No other artifact from any civilization, not the Imperiums, not the Eldars, not the Necrons, has survived 60 million years of continuous operation. The webway was built to last, and it has lasted. And the lasting speaks to a quality of construction that the galaxy's current civilizations cannot approach. The Eldar use it. The Dark Eldar depend on it. Comorra, the Dark City, exists within the webway itself. An entire civilization housed in a dimensional space that the Old Ones created, and that the Dark Eldar have occupied like squatters in a palace built by gods. The Craftworld Eldar navigate it, using the passages to move their enormous world ships between destinations without the risk of warp travel. The Harlequins, the Eldar's most mysterious and most ancient warrior performers, travel through it with an intimacy that suggests they understand its structure more deeply than any other users. None of them built it. None of them fully understand it. The Eldar inherited the webway the way a child inherits a house. They live in it. They use it. They maintain what they can and accept the deterioration of what they cannot. But the original builder's understanding of the structure is not available to them. The Old One's knowledge of how the webway was constructed, the principles that governed its relationship to the Imperium, the techniques that allowed stable tunnels to be created through a dimension that is inherently unstable, was lost when the Old Ones disappeared. The webway is decaying. Slowly across the millions of years since the Old Ones' departure, the network has been deteriorating. Tunnels have collapsed. Junctions have been severed. Regions of the webway have been breached by the warp's increasingly hostile entities, creating pockets of demonic contamination that make those sections impassable. The structural damage that the war in heaven inflicted, the Necron dolmen gates, the enslaver incursions, the Old One's own deliberate destructions, has never been repaired. Because the knowledge required to repair it is the Old One's knowledge, and the Old Ones are gone. The Necrons have their own way into the webway. The dolmen gates, the technology that the Burning One showed them, that allowed Necron forces to breach the webway's walls from the material side, are still functional. The Necrons who have awakened from the Great Sleep use these gates to access the webway's passages, and the access is not sanctioned by anyone, not by the Eldar, who consider the webway their inheritance, not by any other authority that claims jurisdiction over the dimensional space. The Necrons' access is corrosive. The dolmen gates do not create clean openings. They tear through the webway's boundaries, creating breaches that the webway's self-maintenance cannot fully repair, and that the warp's entities can exploit. Every time a Necron dynasty activates a dolmen gate, the damage to the webway increases. The network is being degraded by the same civilization that helped destroy the civilization that built it, and the degradation is accelerating as more Necron tomb worlds awaken and more dolmen gates are activated. The Emperor of Mankind attempted to build his own extension of the webway. The Imperial Webway Project, the work that consumed the Emperor's attention in the years before the heresy, the project he was conducting beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, when Horus's rebellion forced him to abandon it, was an attempt to create a human-controlled section of the dimensional network, not dependent on the Eldar's navigational knowledge, not vulnerable to the Necron's dolmen gates. A passage built by human hands, using technology that the Emperor had developed from principles he understood, principles that may have been derived from the Old One's own knowledge, or that may have been independently arrived at by a psychic being of sufficient power. The project failed. Magnus the Red's psychic message to the Emperor, the warning about Horus's treachery, sent through the warp with power that shattered the project's protective wards, breached the tunnel the Emperor was building. Daemons poured through the breach. The project was destroyed, and the Emperor was forced to sit on the golden throne to keep the breach sealed. A duty that has consumed him for 10,000 years and that has prevented him from completing the work he started. The irony is devastating. The Emperor's attempt to recreate the Old One's greatest achievement was destroyed by the same force that destroyed the Old One's original, the corrupted warp, pressing through the barriers, contaminating the dimensional space that was supposed to provide safe travel. The Emperor's project failed for the same fundamental reason the Old One's webway was compromised. The medium the tunnels pass through is hostile, and the hostility cannot be permanently excluded. The webway persists. Damaged, diminished, contested, used by the Eldar as a lifeline, breached by the Necrons as an invasion route, lost to the Emperor as a dream that the heresy prevented from being realized. The Old One's greatest creation endures in a state that the Old Ones would not have recognized and would not have accepted. A palace inhabited by squatters, its walls crumbling, its corridors haunted by things that the builders would have expelled, its purpose served imperfectly by inheritors who cannot maintain what they have inherited. 60 million years of decay, and the webway is still the most advanced piece of engineering in the galaxy. This is the Old One's legacy in its most tangible form, a creation that outlasted its creators by 60 million years, and that is still, even in its diminished state, the most valuable strategic asset in the Milky Way. The Chaos Gods did not exist when the Old Ones were alive. This fact is the most consequential piece of information in the entire history of the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy, and it is the fact that connects the Old One's story to every other story in the setting. Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, Slaanesh, the four ruinous powers that have defined the galaxy's spiritual landscape for millennia, that have corrupted civilizations and consumed species and turned the dimension beyond the material into a hunting ground for predatory intelligences. None of them existed when the Old Ones walked the galaxy. The Imperium that the Old Ones knew was calm. The psychic dimension that their civilization was built around, the dimension they had mastered, that they had built the webway through, that they had studied for millennia with the patience of a species whose lifespans permitted the kind of deep, sustained engagement that shorter-lived species could not attempt, was not hostile. It did not contain gods. It did not contain daemons. It was a dimension of energy, responsive to the psychic emissions of sentient life, but not organized into the predatory structures that the warp's current inhabitants represent. The war in heaven changed this. The suffering that the war produced, the deaths of billions, the extinction of species, the cataclysmic violence that raged across the galaxy for millennia, flooded the Imperium with psychic energy of such intensity and such negativity that the dimension could not absorb it without being fundamentally transformed. The transformation was not instantaneous. The entities that would eventually become the Chaos Gods coalesced across aeons, accumulating from the concentrated psychic emissions that the galaxy's sentient species produced, growing as the species grew, feeding on the emotions that their expanding populations generated. Khorne, the blood god, born from violence, from rage, from the accumulated psychic charge of every act of war and murder and fury that the galaxy's inhabitants produced. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, born from ambition, from the desire for power and knowledge, and the manipulation of fate, from every scheme and every plan and every moment of calculated betrayal. Nurgle, the Plague Lord, born from despair, from the fear of death and decay, from every moment of suffering that disease and entropy produced in beings who did not want to die. Slaanesh, born last, born from the Eldar's fall, from excess, from sensation, from the pursuit of experience pushed past the point where experience becomes self-destruction. Each of these gods traces its existence back to the corruption of the Imperium. The corruption traces back to the war in heaven. The war in heaven traces back to the Necrontyr's bargain with the Satan. The bargain traces back to the Necrontyr's petition. The petition traces back to the Old One's refusal. The chain is unbroken. The Old One's decision not to share their longevity with the Necrontyr is the first link in a causal chain that ends with the Chaos Gods. This is not the Old One's fault in the moral sense. They did not intend to create the Chaos Gods. They did not know, when they refused the Necrontyr's petition, that the refusal would produce a war that would corrupt the medium their civilization depended on, and that the corruption would eventually give birth to entities of malevolent psychic power whose existence would define the galaxy's spiritual landscape for eternity. But causation does not require intention. The Old One's refusal produced the consequence. The consequence produced the Chaos Gods. The Chaos Gods exist because the Old Ones made a choice 60 million years ago, and the choice's consequences are still running. Every act of chaos corruption in the 41st millennium, every daemon summoned, every world consumed by warp storms, every psyche driven mad by the entities pressing at the barrier between dimensions, is a consequence of the war in heaven. Every moment of chaos-spawned suffering is the echo of a decision made by a species that has been extinct for longer than most of the galaxy's current inhabitants have existed. The Chaos Gods are the Old One's grandchildren, not created by the Old Ones directly, but produced by the conditions the Old Ones created through their actions and their failures. The Chaos Gods are what happens when the gardener's garden is burned, and the garden's ashes poison the water supply, and the poisoned water breeds diseases that the gardener never imagined. The Old Ones would be horrified if they could see what the Imperium has become, the dimension they mastered, the calm psychic medium they built their civilization around, transformed into a realm of predatory gods and screaming daemons and the cosmic malice that makes the 41st millennium the nightmare it is. The Old Ones would recognize their failure in the worst possible way. They did not fail because they were incompetent. They failed because they were fallible, and the consequences of their fallibility were proportional to the scale of their civilization. A species that operates at the galactic level produces galactic-level consequences when it makes mistakes. The Old One's mistake was the refusal, the decision not to help the Necrontyr, which produced the war, which corrupted the warp, which created the conditions for the Chaos God's emergence. One refusal, 60 million years of consequences, 4 gods born from the wreckage. The galaxy has been living with these consequences since before humanity evolved, and the consequences show no sign of diminishing. The Chaos Gods are not temporary. They are not a disease that will run its course. They are permanent features of the warp's landscape, self-sustaining entities that feed on the emotions of the galaxy's sentient species, and that will persist as long as sentient species exist to feed them. The Old Ones created the conditions for eternal war, not between armies, not between civilizations, but between the material universe and the corrupted dimension that underlies it. The war they started 60 million years ago is still being fought, and the weapons it produced, the Chaos Gods, the daemons, the corrupted warp, are still being deployed against the galaxy's inhabitants. There is no end to this war. The conditions that produce it, the existence of sentient species whose emotions feed the warp, are the conditions that sentient existence requires. To end the war would require ending sentient life, which is the solution the Cabal proposed to the Alpha Legion and which the galaxy has so far rejected. The Old One's legacy is eternal war. Not because they wanted it, because the consequences of their existence are too deeply embedded in the galaxy's structure to be removed without removing the structure itself. The Necrons are waking up. Across the galaxy, on tomb worlds that have remained sealed for 60 million years, the crypts are opening. The machine warriors who entered the Great Sleep at the war in Heaven's End, who buried themselves beneath the surfaces of worlds that would develop new life in their absence, that would build new civilizations ignorant of the sleepers beneath their feet, are emerging from their dormancy. The Necron dynasties are reactivating. The tomb complexes are powering up. The machine legions that destroyed the Old Ones are coming back to a galaxy that has changed beyond recognition and that does not know what it is waking to face. The awakening is the Old One's final legacy, made physical. Every Necron who emerges from a tomb is a warrior whose existence began with the Necrontyr's petition and the Old One's refusal. Every Necron dynasty that reactivates is a fragment of the civilization that waged the war in heaven, returning to a galaxy that has been shaped by the war's consequences ever since it ended. The Necrons are the past coming back. 60 million years of the past, compressed into machine bodies that remember what happened and that intend to reclaim what the Great Sleep put on hold. For the Imperium, the Necron awakening is a threat that the standard military calculus struggles to accommodate. The Imperium's enemies are numerous and varied. but most of them are enemies the Imperium's institutions have developed responses to. The orcs are fought with massed firepower and strategic containment. Chaos is fought with faith and fire and the Inquisition's specialized capability. The Tyranids are fought with a desperate ingenuity that an existential biological threat demands. The Necrons are different. They are a civilization that predates every other living civilization by tens of millions of years. Their technology is not derived from the same principles that the Imperium's technology uses. Their military capability is not bounded by the same constraints that limit biological armies. Their strategic patience, the patience of beings who slept for 60 million years and who have eternity to complete whatever they intend, exceeds anything the Imperium can match. And the Necrons remember the old ones. The machine consciousness that biotransference preserved, diminished, yes, stripped of the emotions and the passions that made the Necrontyr alive, retains the memory of the war that made the Necrons what they are. The hatred that drove the Necrontyr to petition the Satan to undergo biotransference, to wage a war that consumed the galaxy's first civilization, that hatred persists in whatever form machine consciousness can sustain it. The Necrons look at the galaxy's current inhabitants and they see the Old Ones as orphans. The Eldar, created by the Old Ones as weapons against the Catan. The Orcs, created by the Old Ones as biological warfare platforms. Humanity, seeded by the Old Ones on a world the Necrontyr never reached. Every species the Necrons encounter is a reminder of the civilization that refused them and that the Necrons destroyed. And the reminder does not produce nostalgia. The awakening also returns the Catan shards to the battlefield. The fragmented star gods, imprisoned by the Necrons after the revolt, are deployed as weapons, the most powerful weapons in the Necron arsenal, brought out for engagements where the standard military force is insufficient. The Catan shards are the Old Ones' enemies in their most diminished form, pieces of the gods that devoured the Old Ones' civilization, broken and contained, used by the civilization that broke them as tools of war. The galaxy that the Old Ones gardened is now inhabited by the gardener's enemies, the gardener's abandoned weapons, and the gardener's unintended creations. The Necrons who destroyed the Old Ones, the Eldar who were the Old Ones' finest creation, the Orcs who were the Old Ones' most dangerous weapon, the Chaos Gods who were born from the Old Ones' failure, humanity, the seed the Old Ones planted and did not tend. All of them sharing the same galaxy, fighting the same wars, living in the consequences of events that occurred before any of them, except the Necrons, existed in their current form. The garden is wild. The gardener is gone. The things growing in the garden are fighting each other with the tools the gardener left behind, and the weapons the gardener's enemies wielded, and the corrupted energies of the dimension the gardener accidentally destroyed. And the fighting has been going on for 60 million years, and it shows no sign of stopping. Because the conditions that produce the fighting, the legacy of the Old Ones, embedded in the galaxy's biology and geography and dimensional structure, cannot be removed without destroying the galaxy that contains them. The standard account describes the Old Ones as benevolent, gentle, nurturing, the gardeners who tended the galaxy with patience and care, who seeded life because they valued life, who created species because the creation of species was an expression of their fundamental generosity. This account deserves scrutiny because the evidence supports a more complicated picture. The Old Ones created species to serve them. The Eldar were not created as an act of cosmic generosity. They were created as weapons. The Krork were not nurtured into existence through the patient processes that benevolent stewardship implies. They were engineered as biological warfare platforms, designed for violence, built to fight and reproduce and fight again in an endless cycle that served the Old One's military needs. The Jokero, the Hrud, the Khnib, the Rashan, each was created or modified to serve a function in the war in heaven, a function that served the Old One's survival rather than the created species' well-being. The creation was instrumental. The species were tools, sophisticated tools, autonomous tools, tools that were given the capacity for independent existence and cultural development, but tools nonetheless, created to serve the Creator's purposes and released into the galaxy when the Creator's existence ended. The Eldar's psychic sensitivity, the gift that made them the Old One's most powerful allies against the Catan, is also the curse that produced the fall and birthed Slanesh. The Old Ones gave the Eldar a capability that was devastating in the calm Imperium they knew, and that was catastrophic in the corrupted warp that the war in heaven produced. Whether the Old Ones anticipated this, whether they understood when they designed the Eldar's psychic connection that the connection would become dangerous if the Imperium were corrupted, is unknown. But the gift that was supposed to save the galaxy helped destroy it, and the Old Ones were the ones who gave it. The Krork's biological imperative toward violence was not a side effect. It was the purpose. The Old Ones created a species that existed to fight, and they released that species into a galaxy that would be left without the oversight required to manage the fighting. The Orcs, the degraded descendants of the Krork, have been fighting for 60 million years, consuming worlds and civilizations with a biological relentlessness that no force has been able to stop. The Old Ones designed this. They chose to create a species that could not stop fighting, because the war they were losing required a weapon that would never stop. Whether this was benevolent depends on how you define benevolence. If benevolence means nurturing life for its own sake, the Old One's creation of the Krork was not benevolent. It was pragmatic. And the pragmatism produced a species whose existence has been one of the galaxy's most destructive forces for 60 million years. If benevolence means acting in the best interests of the galaxy as a whole, the Old One's creation of psychically enhanced warrior races was not benevolent. It was a desperate gamble that produced the corruption of the warp and the eventual emergence of the Chaos Gods. The Old One's refusal to help the Necrontyr is also worth examining through this lens. The benevolent account describes the refusal as wisdom, the Old Ones judging that the Necrontyr were too dangerous to be trusted with immortality. The critical account describes the refusal as indifference, the Old Ones deciding that the Necrontyr's suffering was not their concern. A third account, the most uncomfortable one, describes the refusal as calculation. The Old Ones were the galaxy's dominant civilization. The Necrontyr were a potential rival, a species whose technology was advanced and whose hatred of the Old Ones, if combined with immortality, might have produced a competitor that the Old Ones did not want to face. The refusal to share the secret of longevity was not benevolence, and it was not indifference. It was the protection of a monopoly. The Old Ones were the galaxy's gods, and gods do not create equals. This interpretation is harsh. It may not be accurate, but it is consistent with the evidence, and the evidence is all we have. Because the Old Ones are not available to explain themselves. They left a galaxy full of consequences, and no explanation for the choices that produced them. And the galaxy has been constructing explanations ever since. Some generous, some critical, all speculative, without the benefit of the beings who actually made the decisions. The Old Ones may have been benevolent. They may have been pragmatic. They may have been self-interested. They may have been all three simultaneously, because civilizations that last for geological timescales do not maintain a single moral character across their entire existence. The Old Ones who seeded life across the galaxy with patient generosity may have been different beings from the Old Ones who engineered the Krork as biological weapons of mass destruction. The species may have changed across its immense lifespan, and the benevolent phase and the desperate phase may represent different eras of the same civilization responding to different conditions. What is certain is that the consequences of the Old Ones' actions are not uniformly benevolent. The Eldar, the Orcs, the corrupted warp, the Chaos Gods, the webway that is decaying, the Necrons who are waking, each of these is a legacy of the Old Ones' decisions. And each has produced suffering on a scale that would be difficult to justify as the product of a genuinely benevolent civilization's choices. The Old Ones created the conditions for the galaxy's current nightmare. Whether they did so from kindness or from necessity or from a combination of both does not change the nature of the nightmare. The galaxy is living in the Old One's dream, and the dream has been a nightmare for 60 million years. There is a pattern in the galaxy's history, and the pattern begins with the Old Ones. The Old Ones mastered the Imperium. They built a civilization around it. They used it as the foundation for everything: travel, communication, the webway that connected their worlds. They depended on the Imperium's stability for the functioning of their entire galactic project. And when the Imperium was destabilized, when the war they were fighting corrupted the dimension they depended on, their civilization collapsed. The Eldar inherited the Imperium's corrupted version and built their civilization around it too. They expanded the webway. They used their psychic gifts to create art and technology of extraordinary sophistication. They depended on their connection to the warp for everything that made their civilization function. And when their connection to the warp was exploited, when their emotions, amplified by the corrupted dimension, produced the excess that birthed Slaanesh, their civilization collapsed. The Emperor attempted to master the warp in his own way. He built the Astronomicon. He launched the Imperial Webway project. He created the Space Marines through genecraft that the Old Ones would have recognized as a variant of their own methods. He depended on the warp for interstellar travel, for psychic communication, for the navigation of the Imperium's fleets. And when the warp was used against him, when Magnus's psychic message shattered the Webway project's wards, when the Chaos Gods turned the warp into a weapon against the Emperor's works, his project was crippled. The pattern is this: every civilization that attempts to use the warp as a foundation is eventually destroyed by the warp. The medium that provides the power also provides the vulnerability, and the vulnerability is eventually exploited, and the exploitation is catastrophic. The Old Ones were the first to discover this pattern. They did not discover it in time to save themselves. The Eldar were the second. They did not discover it either. The Imperium is the third, and the Imperium is currently in the process of discovering it. And the discovery is the crisis that defines the 41st millennium. Whether the pattern can be broken is the galaxy's most fundamental question. Is the warp inherently dangerous? Is any civilization that depends on it inherently doomed? Is the corruption that the war in heaven produced a permanent feature of the dimension, or is it a condition that could, theoretically, be reversed? The Old Ones knew the answer to these questions. They understood the Imperium better than any subsequent species has understood it. They knew its properties, its limitations, the conditions required to use it safely. And they are gone. The knowledge they possessed, the understanding that might have allowed a future civilization to avoid the pattern's recurrence, is gone with them. The Eldar know fragments. The Craftworld Eldars, Farseers and Warlocks retain a diminished version of the understanding the Old Ones passed to their creations, enough to navigate the webway and wield psychic power with relative safety, not enough to reverse the corruption that makes the warp dangerous. The Dark Eldar have found a way to avoid the warp's influence entirely through the pain and suffering they inflict on others, a solution that is worse than the problem it solves. The Harlequins may know more, but the Harlequins do not share what they know. Humanity has no inherited understanding of the warp at all. The Emperor's knowledge, however he acquired it, died with his capacity for communication when he was placed on the Golden Throne. The Imperium navigates the warp through brute force and faith, using the Astronomicon and the Navigators, and the Geller fields and the prayers of the faithful, and the navigation works often enough to sustain the Imperium and fails often enough to remind the Imperium that the warp is not a dimension that human technology has mastered. The pattern continues. The Old Ones built on the warp and were destroyed by it. The Eldar built on the warp and were destroyed by it. The Imperium is building on the warp and the destruction is ongoing. The pattern suggests that the warp cannot be used as a foundation, that the dimension is too hostile, too responsive to the negative emissions of sentient life, too prone to producing entities that feed on the species that depend on it. But the alternative to using the warp is isolation. Without the warp, interstellar travel is impossible at the speeds required to maintain a galactic civilization. Without the Astronomicon, the Imperium's navigators cannot chart courses through the void. Without psychic communication, the Imperium's worlds cannot coordinate. The warp is the foundation that the galaxy's civilizations build on, because there is no other foundation available. The Old Ones found the Imperium when it was calm, and they built on it, and the building was magnificent, and the magnificence lasted for longer than most species have existed. And then the calm was destroyed, and the building collapsed, and the collapse produced consequences that are still running 60 million years later. The question the pattern raises is whether the calm can be restored, whether the warp can be returned to the state it occupied before the war in heaven. The formless, non-hostile, non-predatory dimension that the Old Ones built their civilization around. If the corruption can be reversed, the pattern can be broken, and the galaxy's civilizations can build on the warp without the building eventually destroying them. If the corruption cannot be reversed, if the chaos gods and the demonic entities and the hostile psychic landscape of the warp are permanent features that cannot be eliminated, then the pattern is terminal. Every civilization that uses the warp will eventually be destroyed by it, and the galaxy's history will be an endless succession of civilizations rising and falling in the ruins of their predecessors' warp-dependent achievements. The Old Ones would know the answer. The Old Ones are not here to give it. This is perhaps their most devastating legacy. Not the Chaos Gods, Not the orcs, not the corrupted warp, but the absence of the knowledge that might have allowed a future civilization to avoid the mistakes the old ones made. The gardener is gone. The garden manual was lost with him. And the garden is growing in directions that no gardener intended, producing things that no gardener would have permitted, consuming itself with the same energy that once sustained it. The old ones disappeared 60 million years ago. The word disappeared is chosen deliberately over the word died, because the evidence does not conclusively support extinction. The evidence supports absence, the complete withdrawal of the old ones from the galaxy's observable affairs, the cessation of their influence on the galaxy's development, the silence of a species that had been the galaxy's most active voice for longer than any subsequent civilization has existed. Absence is not death. And the distinction between the two has haunted the galaxy's oldest memories for 60 million years. The Eldar's deepest mythologies, the stories that the Craftworld Farseers tell in the most private rituals, the legends that the Exodites preserve in oral traditions that predate the Craftworld's existence by millions of years, contain references to the old ones that are not entirely past tense. The rune singers of Craftworld Kayla describe the webway as having been created by the old ones, a statement of historical fact, but they also speak of the old ones in terms that suggest possibility rather than finality, as beings whose departure from the stage does not necessarily mean departure from existence. The webway itself is the strongest evidence for survival. The network's continued function, degraded, yes, but function, suggests that whatever maintenance the webway requires is being provided from somewhere. The Eldar maintain what they can, but the Eldar's maintenance capability is a fraction of the old one's original. The webway should, by any reasonable engineering assessment, have collapsed entirely across 60 million years of unmaintained operation in a hostile dimensional environment. It has not collapsed. It has degraded, but it persists. Something is maintaining it at a level that exceeds what the Eldar's own efforts can account for. Whether that something is a residual property of the webway's construction, a self-maintenance capability that the old ones built into the network, or evidence that the old ones themselves are still active in some form, maintaining their greatest creation from a location the galaxy's current inhabitants cannot detect, is not known. Both explanations are consistent with the available evidence. Neither can be confirmed. There are other hints, artifacts that surface on worlds across the galaxy, devices of unknown origin, constructed from materials that the Mechanicus cannot identify, operating on principles that the Imperium's technology does not encompass. Some of these artifacts are attributed to the Old Ones by the xenoarchaeologists who study them, based on age estimates that place them in the era before the war in heaven. Others are more ambiguous, artifacts whose age cannot be determined with precision, whose construction methods are consistent with Old One's technology, but whose provenance cannot be confirmed. The Necron Overlord trays in the infinite, the Collector, the Archivist, the being whose obsession with preserving the galaxy's history has made him the most knowledgeable individual in the Milky Way regarding pre-heresy and pre-human events, is rumored to possess artifacts that he attributes to the Old Ones. Whether Trazin's attributions are accurate, whether his collection includes genuine Old Ones technology, or whether the items he identifies as Old Ones artifacts are misattributed pieces of a different ancient civilization's work, is debated. Trazin himself does not share his assessments widely. The Collector keeps his own counsel. The Slann are the most persistent mystery. In the oldest versions of the galaxy's history, the versions that predate the current understanding, and that survive in fragments of lore that the Imperium scholars do not always cross-reference with the canonical accounts, the Slann are described as the Old One's servants. Reptilian or amphibian beings, created by the Old Ones to serve as their intermediaries with the younger species. The biological instruments through which the Old One's will was expressed in the material universe. Some accounts go further and suggest that the Slann were not servants of the Old Ones, but were the Old Ones themselves, that the name Old Ones refers to the same species that other accounts call the Slann, and that the distinction between the two is a product of different cultures describing the same beings in different terms. Whether the Slann still exist, whether a population of the Old One's servants or the Old Ones themselves persist somewhere in the galaxy, hidden from detection by the same mastery of the Imperium that allowed the Old Ones to build the webway, is one of the more enduring questions in the field of xenoarchaeology. The Slann have not been reliably documented in the current era, but the absence of documentation is not the same as absence, and a species that was designed to be the intermediary of a civilization that valued concealment might be very good at avoiding documentation. The galaxy is large. The webway is vast, and much of it is unexplored, even by the Eldar, who have used it for millions of years. The dimensions adjacent to the material universe, the Imperium, the subdimensions that the webway passes through, the spaces between spaces that the Old Ones understood and that no subsequent civilization has fully mapped, contain volumes of unexplored territory that could conceal anything. Could conceal the Old Ones themselves. If the Old Ones survived the war in heaven, if they fled into the webway's deepest reaches, or into a dimension that the galaxy's current inhabitants have not discovered, or into a state of existence that the material universe's physics cannot detect, they could be there, watching, waiting, maintaining the webway from their place of concealment, observing the garden they planted 60 million years ago and the wild, terrible, beautiful things it has produced in their absence. This is speculation. It is not supported by evidence that would satisfy a rigorous analyst, but the Old One's own history is a history of concealment, of the webway's hidden passages, of the Imperium's undetectable structures, of a civilization that operated across dimensions that other species could not perceive. A civilization with that capability does not necessarily reveal itself when it survives. It might choose to remain hidden. It might have reasons for remaining hidden that the galaxy's current inhabitants cannot comprehend, because the reasons depend on an understanding of the galaxy's situation that only the Old Ones possess. Or they are gone. Truly, completely, irrevocably gone. Destroyed by the war in heaven, consumed by the enslavers, erased from existence by the same catastrophe that corrupted the dimension they had mastered. The artifacts are remnants. The webway's persistence is residual engineering. The hints are noise, not signal. The Old Ones are dead, and the galaxy is an orphanage. And the children have been fighting each other in the ruins of the family home for 60 million years. Both possibilities are real. Neither can be ruled out. The galaxy does not know whether it is alone, whether the gardener is truly gone, or merely hiding or watching from a distance that the garden's current inhabitants cannot perceive. 60 million years of silence. The silence could be final. The silence could be patience. With the Old Ones, the difference between the two has always been impossible to determine. The galaxy is 60 million years old since the last time anyone was in charge. That is the fundamental condition of the 41st millennium. And it is the condition that the old ones produce, not the wars, though the wars are consequences of their existence. Not the Chaos Gods, though the Chaos Gods were born from the corruption they caused. Not the Necrons, though the Necrons were created by the hatred they inspired. The condition, the underlying state of affairs in which the galaxy finds itself, a garden without a gardener, a project without a director, a civilization-sized experiment running unattended for 60 million years, and producing results that nobody is evaluating. Every faction in the 41st millennium is living in the Old One's shadow. The Imperium of Man fights wars against enemies whose existence traces back to the Old One's decisions, the Orcs who are the Old One's weapons, the chaos that was born from the Old One's war, the Necrons who are the Old One's enemies. The Eldar navigate a webway the Old Ones built, using psychic gifts the Old Ones designed, carrying the genetic legacy of a species created for a purpose that has been obsolete for 60 million years. The Orcs fight because the Old Ones built them to fight, and the fighting continues because nobody has been able to override the Old Ones' programming. The Necrons stir from tombs they entered when the Old Ones were destroyed, carrying grudges that originated in the Old Ones' refusal to share what the Necrontyr needed to survive. Everyone is fighting the Old One's war. The war in heaven never ended. It changed shape, from a galactic conflict between identifiable civilizations to a structural condition embedded in the galaxy's biology, geography, and dimensional architecture. The combatants are different, the weapons are different, but the war is the same war, the conflict between order and entropy, between the attempt to build something lasting in the galaxy and the forces that tear lasting things apart. The Old Ones fought this war and lost. The Eldar fought this war and fell. The Emperor fought this war and was broken. The Imperium is fighting this war now. And the fighting is the daily experience of every human being in the 41st millennium. And the war's ultimate outcome, whether the galaxy can be made safe for civilization, whether the corruption can be reversed, whether the garden can be tended again by someone who understands what the garden needs, is the question that the 41st millennium is attempting to answer. The answer depends on whether the Old One's mistakes can be avoided, whether a civilization can use the warp without being consumed by it, whether the warrior races can be managed without the Old One's oversight, whether the Chaos Gods can be defeated without destroying the sentient life that feeds them, whether the Necrons can be addressed without repeating the cycle of conflict that the Necrontyr's original petition began. These are not military questions. They are not questions that can be answered by the application of bolter fire and faith, however much the Imperium would prefer them to be. They are existential questions. Questions about the nature of the galaxy, about the relationship between the material universe and the dimension that underlies it, about whether the conditions that produced the 41st millennium's nightmare are permanent features of existence or problems that can be solved by a civilization with sufficient understanding. The Old Ones had sufficient understanding. They are gone. The Emperor may have had sufficient understanding. He is on the golden throne, silent, sustaining the Astronomicon through the remains of his psychic power, unable to communicate whatever he knows. The Eldar had partial understanding. They are diminished, fragmented, a species whose population is a fraction of what it once was, fighting for survival with the remnants of the knowledge their creators gave them. Nobody currently in the galaxy has the complete picture. Nobody understands the warp the way the Old Ones understood the Imperium before it was corrupted. Nobody possesses the technology to build what the Old Ones built, or to repair what the Old Ones' war destroyed, or to reverse the corruption that the Old Ones' war produced. The knowledge is lost, and the galaxy needs it. Desperately, urgently, existentially needs the understanding that the Old Ones possessed and that 60 million years of silence have erased. Somewhere in the galaxy, the webway persists. Damaged, decaying but persisting, the tunnels that the Old Ones built 60 million years ago still connect the stars, still provide passage through the dimension that threatens to consume everything that enters it unprotected. The webway is a message from the past, proof that the warp can be navigated safely, that the dimension can be used without the corruption that currently makes it dangerous, that the galaxy's civilizations do not have to accept the warp's hostility as a permanent condition. The message says, this was possible once. It could be possible again. Somewhere in the galaxy, the Eldar carry the gene seed of the Old One's design, the psychic capability that was supposed to be the weapon against the Catan, the biological inheritance that connects the Eldar to the dimension the Old Ones mastered. The inheritance is both gift and curse, both weapon and vulnerability. And the balance between the two has shifted across 60 million years of the warp's increasing corruption. But the capability is still there. The connection to the realm that underlies the material universe is still active. The Eldar can still do things with the warp that no other species can match, because the Old Ones built them to do those things. Somewhere in the galaxy, the Orcs carry the Old Ones' warrior programming, the biological imperative to fight, the psychic field that makes technology function through belief, the spore-based reproduction that ensures the species cannot be exterminated. The programming is crude now, degraded from the Krork's original sophistication, but it persists. It functions. It has been functioning for 60 million years without maintenance, producing the galaxy's most prolific military force through a mechanism that the Old Ones designed, and that no subsequent force has been able to duplicate or shut down. Somewhere in the galaxy, the Necrons are waking from a sleep that began when the Old Ones fell. The machine warriors who destroyed the first civilization are returning to a galaxy that has been shaped by that destruction. And the returning brings with it the technologies that the Necrons developed during the war in heaven. Technologies that operate on principles the Old Ones' enemies understood, and that the galaxy's current inhabitants do not. The Necrons are carrying the war in heaven's other side of the story into a galaxy that has only heard the Old Ones' side. And the other side may contain knowledge that the galaxy needs. Somewhere, perhaps, the Old Ones themselves persist in the webway's deepest reaches, in a realm that the galaxy's current inhabitants have not mapped, in a state of existence that 60 million years of evolution or transformation has produced. Watching, waiting, maintaining the garden from a distance that their absence has not entirely erased. Or not. The silence may be final, the Old Ones may be gone, truly gone, and the galaxy may be genuinely alone, an orphanage without the prospect of the parents' return, fighting over the inheritance of a family that no longer exists. The galaxy cannot tell. The galaxy has not been able to tell for 60 million years. what the galaxy can do, what every civilization in the 41st millennium is doing, whether it knows it or not, is live in the consequences. Navigate the webway the old ones built. Fight the orcs the old ones created. Resist the chaos the old ones' war produced. Confront the Necrons the old ones' refusal spawned. The old ones started everything. Every thread in the 41st millennium's tapestry traces back to them. Every war, every god, every species, every horror and every wonder. The galaxy is the old one's creation, for better and for worse, and the creation has been running on its own for 60 million years. And the running has not stopped, and the consequences have not been resolved, and the garden has grown so wild that it has forgotten it was ever a garden. But the bones are still there, beneath the chaos and the violence and the 10,000 years of imperial decline and the 60 million years of abandoned cultivation. The structures the old ones built, the species the old ones created, the webway the old ones engineered, the warp that was once calm and that might someday be calmed again. The old ones started everything, including, perhaps, the possibility that everything can be fixed. Whether anyone in the galaxy has the wisdom and the power and the patience to do the fixing is the question that 60 million years have not yet answered. The garden waits.